Washington, D.C. 20001. Or call us at area code 765-464-3080.
Next, you'll hear from Henry Kissinger. The former Secretary of State in the Nixon administration discussed his views on foreign policy earlier this month at the Richard Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California. He talks about his book, Does America Need a Foreign Policy?, and explains his views on U.S. diplomatic efforts in the 21st century. It's an hour.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome the 56th Secretary of State, a great American and a great peacemaker, Henry A. Kissinger. We're also moved. I think I'm hearing martial music playing in my head. My name is John Taylor. I'm director of the Nixon Library. Welcome all of you to an extraordinary morning of vision here at the Nixon Library. I have a couple of housekeeping matters I'd like to do. First of all, I'd like to recognize the founders and the real keepers of the house. Specifically members of our volunteer board of directors at the Richard Nixon Library and Birthplace Foundation, who are responsible for the great success of the only presidential library to be both built and operated without any government funds. We have a policy of not holding our applause at the Nixon Library, so we need a hearty burst. First of all, an extraordinary American and architect of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics and the 2012 Los Angeles Olympics, John Argue. The longtime vice chairman and now distinguished chairman designate of the Nixon Library, Donald L. Bendetti. An extraordinary woman of vision, a friend of many great institutions, including USC and the Nixon Library, a dear friend with her late husband of President Nixon, Catherine B. Locher. When you recognize this man, you recognize a man whose father was the one who urged Richard Nixon to run for Congress in 1946. He is here with his wife, Louise. Would you please recognize Hubert Perry? Ladies and gentlemen, when you recognize this gentleman, also thank him for building all the power plants that Gray Davis is taking credit for, Pete Wilson. At his side, one of the great California First Ladies. Those of you who know her history know of her passion for high school and college science and math. She is now involved in an important effort to develop a summer day camp for exceptional students in math and science. Would you please recognize the lovely Gail Wilson? When President Nixon returned to California in 1974, he had a moment that brought him very near death. At his side at that time, luckily, was his longtime personal physician, John Lundgren. Jack Lundgren passed away a couple of years ago. We are proud to be represented by his son and grandson, John and David Lundgren. That work by Dr. Lundgren enabled Richard Nixon to survive another 20 years, to continue to work for peace and freedom. We also recognize today another great survivor, a man of faith and principle, Carl Karcher. Speaking of summer camps, Mrs. Wilson, some of you might have noticed little children running around in red T-shirts. They're this week's enrollees in the Hands-on History Summer Day Camp. It's our second annual day camp. We've had over 50 children between 8 and 12 enrolled this summer. They're having a wonderful time. They're learning about history. They're learning about the peacemaking work of Richard Nixon and Dr. Kissinger. So when you see them around, please don't trip over them. We don't want to get sued. Dr. Kissinger will sign your copies of his book, Does America Need a Foreign Policy? By the way, the answer is yes, as you're about to hear, in the lobby immediately after here. And if you have friends who'd like the opportunity to have their book signed and missed the chance to be here today, please call them up, because he's going to have a public book signing, Dr. Kissinger is, at 1 o'clock. So there's still plenty of time to have books signed. A brief rundown of what's coming up in our programming. We have a group of Americans who are out in the lobby listening on television because they didn't order on time, unlike you very, very diligent people. Dr. Kissinger spoke to them before he came in, which is why he was a little late. You can order tickets to each of these events today. I believe we have a coupon for you. If not on your chair, we'll give it to you as you leave the auditorium. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, Dennis Hastert, will be here on August 9th. Rush Limbaugh's brother, author David Limbaugh, who's written a book called Absolute Power, The Legacy of Corruption in the Clinton-Reno Justice Department, will be here on August 16th. We have two candidates for the Republican nomination for governor of California slated to come to the Nixon Library. Secretary of State Bill Jones on September 20th, and the son of the founding president of the Nixon Foundation, William E. Simon Jr., on October 10th. Bill Salmon, who's the senior White House correspondent for the Washington Times, has written an important book about the year 2000 election and the events in Florida following it. He'll be here on October 23rd. And finally, there are only a few tickets left for an important speech by Fox News commentator Bill O'Reilly on his new book, The No Spin Zone, on October 18th. So act quickly, particularly on Mr. O'Reilly. Ladies and gentlemen, you know the history of this extraordinary American. He was a refugee with his family from totalitarianism in Europe. He soon made his mark as a leading figure on geopolitics, strategy, and tactics. He worked, of course, for Nelson Rockefeller. He advised Democrats as well, but he also caught the eye of a president who needed someone at his side to make peace in an era of war. And he joined the Nixon administration as National Security Advisor in 1969. He served two presidents as Secretary of State, Presidents Nixon and President Ford. He is the author of 3 monumental memoirs on that time, in addition to many other books, including the present one that brings us here together today. But there's a more important way to look at Dr. Kissinger apart from his biography. We were engaged, all of us, in what President Kennedy called a great twilight struggle. It was probably the most momentous struggle of ideas and will in the history of men and women on this planet. It's called the Cold War. There are people who were right about virtually every important policy decision in the Cold War, beginning with the coming of Lenin to power in the Kremlin in the Stalin era, throughout the Vietnam era, into the latter days of the Cold War. These people include Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. And then there were people who were wrong about virtually every important policy decision of the Cold War. These people, now that the Cold War is over, now that we stand in triumph on behalf of freedom, on behalf of the entire world, are now the critics of Dr. Kissinger and President Nixon. You are part of the effort at the Nixon Library to make sure that those events are remembered correctly and that history learns the right lessons from the visionary leadership of Richard Nixon, a practitioner of peace, and his indispensable advisor, supporter, and friend, Dr. Kissinger. You honor him and a legacy of truth for our time by being at the Nixon Library today. Please welcome Henry Kissinger.
John, friends, it's always a very moving occasion for me to come to the Nixon Library. When I first met Richard Nixon, all our acquaintance was a handshake at a Christmas party of Claire Booth Lewis. And all he knew about me was that I had supported Nelson Rockefeller. And I mention this only to speak about the generosity of spirit of Richard Nixon, that he did not make these decisions on a partisan basis, on a political basis. He thought that perhaps I might make a contribution. And I, frankly, was a little dubious. So I went to see Nelson Rockefeller, and he said, "Don't you understand? He's taking a much bigger chance on you than you're taking on him." And that happened to be the truth. And I think back to that association with enormous pride. Richard Nixon took over the presidency of the United States in the middle of a war where 550,000 Americans were about as far away from this country geographically as you could be, in which the previous administration had stopped the bombing but had received no corresponding quid pro quo from the other side. And where many of those who had involved us in the war joined the peace movement as soon as they left office. So under those conditions, President Nixon managed to withdraw under combat conditions 550,000 American forces and received and obtained an agreement that all the critics had said could never be achieved. And in that difficult period, he also redesigned the whole structure of American foreign policy. Today, with the Cold War behind us, people talk about the complexity of diplomacy in a world in which there are no longer the rivalries of the Cold War. Well, I can tell you, if you study that period carefully, if you consider that we were facing an adversary that was building a huge nuclear capacity, that there were crises all over the world. In 1 month, in September 1970, 20,000 Russian personnel showed up in Egypt. Syria invaded Jordan. 3 planes were hijacked with 400 civilians by the PLO. And a Soviet submarine base was being built in Cuba. Now that month, the president earned his pay. And many of the people who were on the opposite side of most of these debates have forgotten what was achieved. And the fundamental contribution that was made by President Nixon was that he analyzed the international situation as he found it. He decided to end the war, but he also knew that in a world in which so much depended on the credibility of America, on which tens of hundreds of millions depended on us, the word honor was not an empty phrase. And American credibility had to be maintained. But he also felt an obligation to demonstrate to the American people that he had a strategy for peace. And this is what led him into building a foreign policy based on support of our democratic friends. on a recognition of the fundamental American national interest that produced the opening to China, and that enabled us to conduct a diplomacy in which at any moment we were closer to China and the Soviet Union than they were to each other, so that we always had the maximum bargaining position. I mention these facts not only to indicate the legacy of President Nixon, but also to describe the challenge that we are facing at this moment. Now, at the beginning of the 21st century, the Cold War is over. But on the other hand, the whole world is in a state of enormous transformation. The United States is the most powerful nation the world has ever seen. But the issues to which military power is relevant are changing, being modified, and in some respects are shrinking. So a great deal depends on how America conceives its role in the world and what it can do to contribute to a new structure of peace. Now, we Americans are in a unique position among the great nations of the world. We are the only major power that has been populated almost entirely by immigrants. The only major nation that has never had a powerful neighbor on its borders. The only nation that could believe, for the greatest part of our history, that whether we engaged in foreign policy or not was entirely up to us. We have had difficulty believing in foreign policy as a continuing process. Almost every American initiative, even in the post-World War II period, was presented as having a terminal date. All the great initiatives and some of the not so great initiatives were presented to the American people with the argument that a certain amount of effort would enable us to drop the problem. When President Clinton sent troops to Bosnia, he went on television and guaranteed that in 1 year we could solve the problem of Bosnia and American troops would no longer be necessary. But the real problem in foreign policy, 19th century statesman once said, foreign policy is like a play in many acts, which unfolds inevitably once the curtain is raised. The interesting question is not so much the quality of the play, but whether to raise the curtain. Because once you've raised the curtain, the play will be completed, either by the actors or by the audience that mounts the stage. And that's the situation in which we are now in the Balkans. We raised the curtain, and it got us involved in the conflicts of a region that have been going on for hundreds of years, in which 5 years later there are still troops in Bosnia with no real prospect of being able to have solved the problem. And even more so in Kosovo, which was the opening of a new crisis of exactly the same nature in Macedonia. Now, therefore, for us in the 21st century, the important question is, what is the American national interest around the world? We tend to believe that there is one general formula that you can apply everywhere, and that it has, and the same rules exist in one region of the world as in another. What I try to say in this book is that there are at least 3 or 4 different situations that we see in the world today. In relations to Western Europe, and to a considerable extent, the Western Hemisphere, we deal with democracies, and on the whole, with market economics. Their wars are almost inconceivable, except ethnic conflicts. And there, some of the traditional convictions of American leaders like President Wilson are highly applicable. This is where we can try to form a community of democratic states, where we can emphasize free trade, and where we do not have to take fundamental strategic factors into consideration. But when you go to Asia, you're in a different world. There, the nations of the world, of Asia, look at each other as strategic opponents. Wars are not likely, but they're not inconceivable. It is the region in the world in which military budgets in each country are growing, and in which the conduct of foreign policy is very similar in many respects to that of Europe in the 19th century. I'll get back to that in a minute when I talk about Sino-Russian relations. And then we have the Middle East. If Asia is like Europe in the 19th century, Middle East is like Europe in the 17th century. Ideological, partly religious conflict, in which the passions of the ideological convictions override the sort of geopolitical considerations of other regions in the world. And there we found a situation where the attempt to achieve a final resolution last year radicalized the effort rather than calm it down. But the parties might make practical arrangements. What they cannot face is to make an arrangement that recognizes each other in something that is called permanent. Because it's the existence of Israel on the one side, and also the position of the holy places of various religions that has so far not been amenable to compromise. And the effort, which really was a very American traditional effort, to think that in 1 week at Camp David, one could solve permanently an issue that had been going on for decades and in many respects for centuries. It's one of the challenges we face. Now, this is what our new administration confronts around the world. To conduct simultaneously a policy towards the democracies, a policy towards the strategically vital Asia, and an attempt to pacify a region which is riven by ideological conflicts. And to do all of this simultaneously, and all the more so as in the Middle East, in addition to the Arab-Israeli dispute, there is the conflict between fundamentalists and various forms of secular moderates going on side by side. Now, I can't cover all of these issues, but I'd like to discuss one of them, which is the relationship between the three-cornered relationship between Russia, China, and the United States. We, as I said, tend to think that every foreign society is sort of an aspirant American society, and that with just a little tinkering here and there, we can make them like nice Midwestern Americans. But one has to keep in mind a number of things. In the sort of 600 to 700 years of Russian history, invaders have swept across the country, first from the east, then from the west. And Russia developed into one of the greatest empires of the period, different from the British Empire because they annexed contiguous territory. But they moved from the area around Moscow to the center of Europe, to the Pacific, and to the gates of India. They have had arguably the most oppressive governments that any nation has ever suffered. And they have endured it in the name of national greatness and national security. Both of our countries have had a great territory to explore. But ours was developed in the name of liberty. Russia was developed in the name of the greatness of whatever ruler was in power. Nor was there a tradition of separation of church and state as we have known, nor any democratic tradition of any consequence. And China, of course, has had a history of 5,000 years, uninterrupted. And both of these countries have managed to get through their experiences without significant advice from the United States. So especially the Chinese don't take it for granted that we have the precise recipe on how to govern 1.5 billion wild individualists who have oscillated between strong central governments and great, sometimes near chaotic conditions. Now, of course, we would like to see our form of government spread around the world. But we also have to recognize it took several centuries in the West, from the Magna Carta to the development of parliamentary institutions. And it is not going to happen in a few years in other societies. And in the meantime, the United States has to have a foreign policy how to deal with these nations and to contribute to our security. As I said at the beginning, what we attempted to do in the Nixon administration is to make it clear that vital American interests would be defended, come what may. And when you read the criticisms that are being made, that is the charge that is usually leveled against us. But we also wanted to give an opportunity to those countries to come to practical conclusions and practical arrangements with the United States. So the challenge in our relationship with Russia and China is to make clear what our vital interests are but also to create opportunities for the solution of those problems that we can improve without giving up our vital interests. And that means at the same time that those countries develop an interest in good relations with the United States. Now, if this were an academic exercise, I would say, on the face of it, both China and Russia have more to gain from good relations with the United States than they have in good relations with each other. And yet, they have recently, yesterday, signed an agreement, the practical consequence of which requires the closest cooperation between those two countries in times of crisis and on a whole range of international issues. That is not the result, as will undoubtedly be presented, of actions that were taken within the new administration. It is the result of a whole series of oscillations in American foreign policy over the better part of the last decade, which made us look unsteady, capable of certain kinds of sudden interventionism, confusion of domestic politics with international relations. And it should be a challenge to our foreign policy to return to first principles. We are strong enough to deal with even a coalition of Russia and China. But that is not necessary. It does not need to happen. A skillful and wise policy will prevent it from happening. And it is where I go back to the lessons of the Nixon period, because that was the essence of what President Nixon was attempting to do, to position the United States that we had more options than any possible adversary, so that we were always in a position to have more choices than any possible opponent, and therefore in a position not only to protect our security, but to advance our values. That opportunity still exists, but we should not kid ourselves in shrugging off the event of the last few days. And we should take a careful look at what our options are. And I would apply the same principle to other parts of the world. We created or contributed to an explosion in the Middle East by being too ambitious last year. But in the months ahead, when exhaustion has set in, there will be inevitably a challenge of what we mean, if not by peace, by coexistence in the Arab-Israeli dispute, and in a whole range of other problems around the world. And so I'm happy to have this opportunity to be here, to sketch what the fundamental issues are. And the fundamental challenge is, without us, a solution of most problems is impossible. But with us, a solution will also not happen unless we are willing to analyze, as President Nixon did, what the realities of the international situation is. And for that reason, it's important to go back to what John Taylor said. It's important that we understand the history of the Cold War and that we realize that it was ended not by some grandiose individual action, but by some thoughtful analysis and by the willingness to act in the face of great opposition. And when that isn't done, I'm sure that the contribution that President Nixon made will be viewed as one of the seminal contributions in the conduct of American foreign policy. And therefore, I'm honored periodically to come back here and bring that message. And now I'll be glad to answer some of your questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a question, I will bring the microphone to you. I neglected to introduce two board members of the Nixon Foundation, one because he was on the podium and I got confused, Henry Kissinger, and the other because he just got in from Washington, our chairman, George Argyris. Would you please recognize these two board members? Our chairman is also the ambassador designate of President Bush to Spain and is keenly focusing on foreign policy, and I thought I'd impose on him to ask Dr. Kissinger the first question.
Dr. Kissinger, thank you very much again for being here and always being so supportive. And we're here to support what you accomplished with President Nixon here at the Nixon Library for so many years. And so for all of us in the United States and the world, thank you for all that you've done and continue to do. But I'd like to ask Dr. Kissinger if you would comment on the future expansion of the EU and NATO as they look towards broadening their horizons further and bringing in so many countries here in the near future.
Well, there are two aspects to the expansion of the EU. One is the ambitions of the Europeans. The second is the relationship with the United States. From the strictly American point of view, it used to be axiomatic that if Europe united and became more integrated and more powerful, it would share our burdens and it would therefore be in the American interest if that happened. And from a certain point of view, that is true. But there have been a number of realities have emerged. One is that when you try to unite Europe from Slovenia to northern Norway, it is awfully hard to find a common denominator that unites, say, Sicily and Ireland. And so that the temptation increasingly of at least some European leaders, is to try to organize Europe on an anti-American basis and to say Europe is whatever it is that disagrees with the United States. And on a whole host of issues, the Europeans have taken positions that are opposed to the United States. And I've said to a European friend, it is statistically impossible that we are always wrong. Occasionally, we're bound to do something right. And one glaring example, for example, was when earlier this year, the Bush administration, for very good reasons, showed some hesitation in negotiating with North Korea. The Europeans jumped on the other side. Now, the Bush administration had some hesitation because they did not want to repeat a situation in which the North Koreans would present themselves as the advocates of the national interest of Korea, and the South Koreans looked like a kind of American satellite. And they wanted to see first some movements towards improvement of conditions on the Korean Peninsula, such as thinning out of forces along the dividing line or other measures of that kind, before we committed ourselves to what amounted to an economic aid program for North Korea as it had been proposed in the previous administration. We have 50,000 troops in Korea. Nevertheless, the Europeans sent a delegation to North Korea, giving them exactly what they want for nothing, namely economic aid, recognition. And I mentioned this only as an example. But on a whole host of other issues, I was last week in Russia, and I think we're going to come to an agreement on ballistic missile defense with Russia before we do with some of the European countries, which is a ridiculous situation to be in. So from that point of view, I think Europe has to make a decision whether European unity can have a positive meaning other than the constant opposition to the United States, or regular opposition to the United States. The national states don't act that way. I mean, Spain doesn't act that way towards the United States. England doesn't, but I'm talking about the actions of the European Union as an institution. Now, the question of NATO expansion. That issue will really revolve around the Baltic states next year. That will be, the question is whether the Baltic states, which had been members of the Soviet Union from the Soviet point of view, though not recognized by the United States, whether they should join NATO. And that will be a very tough issue to deal with. Because the border of Estonia is about 40 miles from St. Petersburg. And I can tell you from my visit in Russia, that is a hot-button issue. Now, the Europeans are developing a European army, as we've all read, whose primary purpose is to act in situations in which NATO doesn't act, whatever that could conceivably be, since we supplied the largest contingent in NATO. But I suggested at a meeting of Europeans on defense that maybe they should designate that European army for the defense of European countries that were not part of NATO. And then we would back it up and say we defend the European Union in general, and that would ease that NATO problem. That might be an intricate idea if the Europeans were willing to confront Russia with their army. But that's one they have reserved for us. And they want to have the European army in Timor and places like this where there's no great risk. So I think the issue of NATO expansion into former republics of the Soviet Union is one that will be one of the key issues of the next year. And I wonder whether one should take a look at some variation of the idea that I've just proposed.
Dr. Kissinger, I wanted to thank you for being here. My question is a two-part question. First of all, in light of the human rights violations that are going on in China, would you be in favor of continuing the most favored nation status that we've been afforded to give to China? And the second part of that, in light of the Olympics being awarded to Beijing, do you feel that we should boycott the Olympics like President Reagan did in 1980?
Well, actually, it was President Carter who boycotted the Olympics, and the reason was the Olympics in 1980 had been awarded to Moscow when the Soviet Union was still intact, and without opposition from the United States boycotted the Olympics after the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan and conquered an independent country. We have a fundamental challenge in dealing with China. On the one hand, its human rights practices certainly leave a great deal to be desired. At the same time, anyone who has visited China regularly since 1971, as I have, must recognize that there has been a huge progress in human rights, even though a lot still remains to be done. Secondly, China over the next decade, including the period preparatory for the Olympics, is bound to undergo major changes. For one thing, almost the entire Chinese leadership will be replaced in 2003. First time that a constitutional change has taken place in a technically communist country, because they have an age limit and a two-term limit, and between these two provisions, practically every significant Chinese leader will have to retire by 2003. So a whole new generation of leaders is coming into office that was largely, almost exclusively, trained in the West. We don't know them very well, and we don't know exactly what they're going to do, but they are a generation that has lived with the modern technology and has lived with a world in which a large amount of free trade is going on. Thirdly, anybody who has visited China regularly, or even not regularly, if you look at the enormous changes that have taken place in the economic structure of China, it is inevitable that some political changes must come, because you cannot run a modern society. You can run it without democratic system, but you can't run it without some form of constitutionalism in which you have legal procedures to which people can apply and form economic expectations. And all of that is going to happen in the next decade. So the question, I was incidentally at this Olympic meeting because I'm an honorary member, but a non-voting member, so I did not have a vote. But the balance both our country and the Olympic people had to strike is what is more likely to contribute to the evolution of China. And on balance, I think it is more likely that a relationship of cooperation than a relationship of all-out confrontation, because that all-out confrontation will just drive them further on the direction of this Russo-Chinese bloc. And moreover, in the economic field, any gap which we leave is almost certain to be filled by Europeans, Japanese, and others, so that it will largely punish ourselves. So unless something outrageous happens in China in the interval, like the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, or something like Tiananmen Square, I think we should participate in the Olympics, and I think on balance it was the right decision to have been made.
Dr. Kissinger, could you share with us if you have any involvement in the current administration?
Almost all, I would say, all the people that are active in foreign policy are people I've known well for a long period of time. And I know I can reach them on the telephone. On the other hand, I have been in high office, and the one thing generally you don't need is somebody calling you up with the idea that he could do it better because you've been working 18 hours a day, and your tolerance for unsolicited advice is extremely limited. But they have, the administration has from time to time asked my opinion, and I don't have an acute sense of deprivation, and I wish them I wish them every success. Now, I feel that they're my friends, so this is not a problem.
Dr. Kissinger, I have a fun question for you. There's still a few of us around that were in ASTP, as you and Bob Dole were. I'd like you to reflect...
At what?
In ASTP.
ASTP?
Yes, I'd like you to reflect on those years when we were all teenagers.
Oh, my God. In case you, I know you all know exactly what the gentleman is talking about, but for the one or two of you who don't, ASTP is the Army Specialized Training Program, right? And the Army conceived the idea that they wanted not to suffer the excessive casualties among the most highly trained people, and also they wanted to, I don't know what they thought. At any rate, they, I was a buck private in Camp Croft, South Carolina, digging foxholes in the red clay soil of South Carolina, when suddenly people with a certain IQ were permitted to take tests, and then they were sent to college by the Army. And I was first sent to Clemson College, and then to the University of North Carolina, and then to Lafayette College. And one of my experiences at the University of North Carolina was they had to give us Army guys who were there really studying some military duties, so they posted us near the, forget it's a ram, I think. We did our guard duty near the mascot of the University of North Carolina, which is a ram. But before the, some sort of animal like that. But at any rate, luckily I was not on guard duty that night. The night before the Duke game, some Duke students managed to get to the ram and painted it blue. So you can imagine the humiliation for the Army. And we were all confined to Chapel Hill for 3 weeks. Then for some other inexplicable reason, I was sent from there to Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. In North Carolina, I was studying geopolitics. In Lafayette College, I was studying engineering. And the world might have been spared a lot of trouble but then, predictably, there was so much complaint about these Army people going to college at government expense that they pulled all of us out and sent us right back to the infantry, even those who had come from other. And I wound up in the 84th Infantry Division digging foxholes in the swamps of Louisiana. And after a summer of jungle training, was sent to Germany to the coldest winter in a long time. So that's That's my experience in the Army Specialized Training Program.
Thank you. I'm going to make a presentation.
I want to say one thing. I am extremely proud of my Army service. And I came to this country as a refugee, and I had to work in a shaving brush factory before I was drafted with a lot of other immigrants, which is probably why I never lost my accent. But the 84th Infantry Division was from Wisconsin and northern Illinois, and that was really my education in America. And I am very proud of the associations I had and of the service I was permitted to perform with.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Kissinger, you made our world safer for billions of people in the 20th century. You continue to guide us with your wisdom and your vision in the 21st century. You are a national treasure, and we thank you. Now, folks, I told you about our second annual Hands-on History Day Camp, which is underway. Dr. Kissinger is about to meet some future secretaries of state in yonder hallway. At the risk that if he wears it, a Yorba Linda mom or dad will put him in the SUV and take him home, we're going to give him a Hands-on History t-shirt. And right after he has his picture taken with the youngins, he's going to meet you in the lobby to sign your book. So we will see you outside, and drive carefully, and God bless.
Henry Kissinger is currently chairman of Kissinger and Associates, an international consulting firm. His most recent book, Does America Need a Foreign Policy? Toward a New Diplomacy for the 21st Century, is published by Simon and Schuster. You can learn more about it online at simonsays.com.
48 hours of nonfiction books.